Hello, and thank you for joining the Center for Financial Security for our webinar, Does State-Mandated Financial Education Affect Subjective Financial Wellbeing? My name is Hallie Leinhart, and I'm the Assistant Director of the Center for Financial Security here at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Just to give everyone a bit of a rundown on our agenda for today, we'll begin the webinar with a presentation of the research by Carly Urban, who will provide an overview of the study and its findings. Following the research, Jill Jones from NEFI will provide context from the financial education field, and followed by the Secretary of DFI, Kathy Blumenfeld, who will speak from a policy perspective. We will then continue with a question and answer session, so please feel free to submit questions in the question chat box located at the right side of your screen throughout the webinar. Please note that the webinar is being recorded. We will post the recording on our website, cfs.wisc.edu, with the slides within 2 business days. And all registrants will also receive a link to the recording via email within 1 day. I'm very excited to introduce our presenters for today's webinar. Carly Urban is an Associate Professor of Economics at Montana State University. Jill Jones is Managing Director of Research at the National Endowment for Financial Education, or NEFI. And Kathy Blumenfeld is Cabinet Secretary of the Wisconsin Department of Financial Institutions. Thank you all so much for being here. And with that, we'll get started, and I will turn it over to Carly Urban.
Thank you so much, Hallie, and thanks to everybody for joining us today. I'm really excited to be talking about this new work. It's joint with Jeremy Burke and Michael Collins. And before we get started, next slide, please. I need to give you a disclaimer. So this research was supported by a grant from the FINRA Investor Education Foundation, but all results, interpretations, and conclusions expressed are those of the research team alone and do not necessarily represent the views of the FINRA Investor Education Foundation or any of its affiliated companies. So we're only talking for ourselves today. Next slide. So to give you some motivation for kind of what started this project and why we're asking the questions we are, we know that in the current pandemic, we have a spotlight on the financial precarity of many families. And one thing that policymakers have been kicking around is maybe we need to lift up the financial security of future generations by including more personal finance in high school curricula. We know that financial security requires both a strong objective financial situation, so people need things like savings and earnings and some ability to manage your own money and deal with debt and those types of things. But at the same time, you also need the skills and confidence to make sound financial decisions. So you need the ability to want to and to be able to act, right? There's been more recent work that's been developed with initiatives from the CFPB to measure subjective financial well-being. I will abbreviate that as FWB throughout, but I will reiterate throughout, we are talking about subjective financial well-being. And what we're asking in this paper is, what is the causal effect of state-mandated financial education on the subjective financial well-being measure? Next slide. So what is subjective financial well-being? The U.S. Consumer Financial Protection Bureau really spent a lot of time trying to define what financial well-being is, the subjective measure. They really boiled it down to 4 different components. So one is feeling in control over your day-to-day or your month-to-month finances. So being able to keep up with what's going on, having the capacity to absorb a financial shock, being on track to meet financial goals, and having the financial freedom to make the choices that allow you to enjoy your life. Now that can be a variety of different things, and it's really trying to reflect individuals' preferences in addition to their abilities, right? So your goals might be to have a loft in Manhattan. Your goal might also be to have chickens in the middle of nowhere, right? So next slide, please. That said, that measure, the subjective financial well-being measure, is intended to be independent of income. So here, what I've done is I've plotted different income bands and shown you the entire histogram of, so the entire distribution of financial well-being. And you will see that of those who are making under 20 grand a year, there is a whole spectrum of financial well-being scores. So this goes from 0 to 100, and you'll see that that lowest income bracket has low financial well-being scores as well as high financial well-being scores. And then if you look at the bottom right corner, those making $150,000 or more, they also have a wide range of financial well-being scores. Now that middle red line is the average, so you will see that higher incomes are associated with higher financial well-being on average, but there is still this entire distribution of financial well-being scores across each of these individual income bands. And the questions that are asked in the financial well-being scale are really intended to be independent of income. So that's going to be really important throughout. So next slide, please. So what do we already know about state mandated financial education? We know that previous work has shown that requiring financial education in high school before you receive your diploma increases credit scores and decreases delinquency rates. It improves post-secondary financing decisions where students are shifted from higher interest to lower interest financing options. Doesn't necessarily mean that they borrow less, they just borrow more responsibly. It actually increases student loan repayment, so they're more likely to pay down their debt. It decreases high cost borrowing like payday borrowing, and it increases savings and debt to income ratios, particularly for low income populations. We know very little about what it does to subjective measures. So we know objective measures are improving on average, but what's happening to subjective well-being? Next slide. In addition, we know that there are gaps in financial well-being over the life course by both education and gender. So if you look at the first graph to the left, this is just average financial well-being by gender over the life course. So from 25 to 34 and then to 75 plus on the right-hand side. And you'll see that men have higher financial well-beings over almost every period of their life, subjective financial well-beings, than females. And you'll see on the right panel that those who have a college degree or more have higher financial well-being than those with only a high school diploma or those who get some college but not a four-year degree. Next slide. So our research questions are really twofold. First, does state mandated financial education affect financial well-being? And second, are there effects different for those who end up Are these effects different for those who end their education with a high school diploma and those who go on to get more college, or by gender? So we're trying to really build on what we've seen observationally and see if these interventions are more or less effective for different groups. Next slide. So in terms of our contribution to that literature, we're going to be the first to look at the causal effect of state required financial education on a subjective measure of financial well-being. We're going to be able to investigate really long run outcomes. So we're going to look through age 45, as now it's finally possible. We have had really rigorous policies in place for more time now. So we're not just saying what happens to you when you're 18 or 20, we're able to follow you really far through the life course. And then we're going to look at these heterogeneous effects. So are the effects different by educational attainment or gender? Next slide. So in addition to looking at this financial well-being measure, this dependent variable in depth, we need to think about what our intervention is. So what financial education graduation requirements actually mean. We update our state level data that Max Schmeiser and I put together in 2014 to figure out what financial education graduation requirements look like at the state level. So this could include three different things. First, there could be a standalone course requirement in personal finance. So the state could require this. Prior to this year, only 5 states had those types of requirements, but that's one option. A second is to take a class that integrates personal finance into another class, like economics, for example. This is more popular for states to require personal finance within something else. And then a third option that we're calling all of these graduation requirements is that you have to complete a substantial number of standards in personal finance as part of a larger content area like social studies. So we define substantial here to mean more than just like 1 or 2 standards. So not just adding interest rates to social studies, but you need something that's more meaty than that, let's say. But for the most part, most of the standards that you would expect do check that box. Next slide. So here's a map of financial education graduation requirements with the first graduation cohort. If you are from a state and you're like, I think mine's wrong, then I'm happy to talk to you about that. Email me your graduation requirements documents for every time they've changed in the last decade at least, and then the standards every time they were rewritten. And I'm happy to update this. Next slide. So what happens in these courses? Some of the most important and common topics we've seen covered systematically in standards at the state level are things like calculating and comparing debt with different interest rates. That could include student debt, auto loans, things like that. Understanding credit scores, again, incurring long-term debt, what that means, using credit cards, income fluctuations, insuring against risk, comparing salaries across occupations, making monthly budgets, things of that nature. Next slide. So what do we think? How might high school financial education coursework affect financial well-being? There's two big channels we're thinking about. One is that you change your expectations. So you learn about your future income and budgeting and what month-to-month expenses and income will look like in your 17 to 18-year-old self, and you have a better expectation of future financial situations. So that could either mean that you change your goals, right? Where you're like, okay, my goals were totally out of range and I need new goals that are more realistic. Or you change your ability to meet those current goals and your goals are still the same, and maybe you're just being more realistic. So it could change kind of just the framing of how you're thinking about everything. The second option is that you could have a real behavior change where you're learning about how to make smarter financial decisions early in life. You don't rack up credit card debt, for example, on unnecessary consumption, and then you could improve your financial situation early in life. That could increase your financial well-being if you are able to make ends meet month to month and improve kind of those day-to-day finances. Next slide. So we're going to use data from the National Financial Capability Study. It's nationally representative. It's also state representative. The 2018 data include the financial well-being scale measure, the subjective measure that we were really interested in getting at from the CFPB. It is the 5-item scale for those interested. We restrict the sample to those who are 18 to 45. That's the population for which we can document policy effects in the pre-post period that we're going to be looking at. And our final samples are just over 12,000. Next slide. So we're going to use a difference in difference method. Don't tune out. I'll boil this down pretty simply. We're going to compare students in states with those financial education graduation requirements before and after those requirements took effect. We're then going to compare students in states without financial education graduation requirements across those exact same time periods. And we're going to compare the difference in growth rates so we can get the causal effect. Next slide. Now, for those of you who don't learn in words, but learn better in pictures, here's kind of an example. Texas introduced with the graduation requirement in 2007. Those graduating in 2007 had to take the core, had to take some personal finance. Those who graduated in 2006 didn't. If we just compare those two, we're missing everything else that's happening nationally. So we can't take out things like, a recession starting. We also can't compare Texas's graduating class of 2007 to New Mexico's graduating class in 2007 because they have entirely different educational systems. And that difference, that comparison would miss any of those differences. It would not be causal. But what we can do is we can compare the 2007 and the 2006 graduating cohorts in Texas to the 2007 and 2006 graduating classes in New Mexico. And we can compare those two differences to see how the growth rates were different, and that will give us a causal effect. Next slide. Okay, so this is the exciting part. This is the results. So first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to show you this causal effect of state required financial education on financial well-being for the overall sample. This is all the way to the left. On average, we do see this positive effect where financial well-being is increasing. Now, if we boil this down a little bit more closely and we separate by gender, like I said earlier, most of the effect is coming from men. The effect is double the size of the overall effect. The effect for females is 0. So we're actually seeing that men are increasing their subjective financial well-being and women's are not changing at all. Okay, so financial education is not changing financial well-being scores, subjective financial well-being scores for women. Now let's look at it separating by educational attainment. So those who have at least some college or a college degree or more have an increase in financial well-being after financial education. So the causal effect of financial education on subjective financial well-being is positive for people who have at least some college. Now, if we look at those who end their education with a high school diploma, they actually have a lower financial well-being score after they have financial education. So the big question is why? Next slide. So we really looked at each question that is within this financial well-being scale to try to figure out what's going on. Women do not see a change in any single question that was asked. So they're no more or less likely to say that any one of the 5 items in the scale are different. Nothing changes. So nothing about their attitudes towards their financial situation or their goals is changing because of financial education. Now for men, they're less concerned that the money that they have won't last. They're less likely to feel like they will never have the things they want in life because of their money situation, and they're less likely to feel like their finances control their lives. Now, why are we seeing this? Are women underconfident after they have financial education compared to before? Are men overconfident after financial education? The answer is we have no idea. It could be either. Yeah, throw it out to you guys. Next slide. Now, I think the education results are really, really interesting. So those who only have a high school diploma, never got any additional schooling, the only change we're seeing is that they're more likely to feel like they will never have the things they want in life because of their money situation. And now I want you to think back and remember that this isn't just when they're 18 to 20 or 22. This is up to age 45. They're still more likely to say, I will never have the things that I want in life because of money. And due to their financial education in high school, they're having this effect. So it's having this really long-term change in the way that this group feels about their finances. And it's not unprogrammed, right? It's not like they felt like that at age 20 and then they made a change. It's that they feel like this for an extended period of their life. For those who have some college, at least some college, but no college degree or no 4-year degree, they're after financial education, they're more likely to say that they have money left over at the end of the month. A little bit more of an objective measure, but we're still calling the whole scale as a financial, relatively subjective. And then those who have a college degree or more are less likely to feel like they will never have the things they want in life because of their money. And then they're less concerned that the money that they have or will save won't last. Next slide. So how do we interpret these effect sizes? I've shown you these like increases, decreases, points here, points there, and you're like, what does that mean? In a prior study that Jeremy Burke had done with co-author, Jeremy's also a co-author in this, he shows that job loss reduces financial well-being by 4.2 points when you look at the whole population. So he has a really cool way of looking at that within individual. So within the same person, after you lose a job, your financial well-being score falls about 4 points. And we're seeing the increase for men is roughly a quarter of the effect of job loss. So about 44% of that size. One caveat to kind of comparing these two is that job loss is episodic, whereas financial knowledge is ideally retained and augmented over the life course. One other thing in interpreting these effect sizes is if you look at all of the states that require either a standalone or that require any financial education as we're defining it in this study, 48% of schools within that state actually comply in terms of have the same policy that the state says that they should have. This makes the effect of the education itself likely double the estimated size, right? So if we're thinking about who's actually affected, it's actually bigger. Next slide. So we also see some changes and improvements in objective financial situations. So talked mostly about subjective, but that we see increased likelihood of holding a rainy day account or checking your savings account for both men and women. So women do see improvements in objective financial situations. We also see an increased likelihood in figuring out how much is needed for retirement for some. There are no clear gains in our sample for those who hold only a high school diploma. There's also no harm to any of their objective financial situation due to financial education. I would also add in here that Melody Harvey has some work that shows that for the population that ends their education with a high school diploma, there is some increases to savings. So there are gains for that group. I think it's a group that needs to be studied more, but there's no evidence that there's harm in any objective measure. Next slide. So what's not driving our results, just to kind of preempt any questions? We do a lot of robustness checks. I encourage you to look at the paper if you really want to get into the nitty-gritty of that. We can rule out all of these following alternative explanations. It's not changes in household formation, so our effects are similar for single and married individuals. There's no effect of financial education on household formation. There's no change in income due to financial education. It's something that it doesn't really affect. That it's not any specific state or specific state policies. We can drop each state one at a time. Results don't change. We can actually drop 2 states, kind of going through every possible option of those 2 pairs of states to drop, and nothing changes. It's not objective financial situation, so controlling for asset levels or household income, if we account for that, it doesn't change our effects on subjective financial well-being. Next slide. So what are our basic conclusions? Based on previous research, we know that state-mandated high school financial education improves financial behaviors. It also improves financial well-being, subjective financial well-being for men and for those with at least some college. Both of those effects are observed over many years post-high school, up to age 45. People who end their education with a high school diploma in states with mandated financial education policies show gains for other outcomes, but not for subjective financial well-being in our study. It actually lowers financial well-being. So we're thinking about 2 different things. Financial education may actually raise awareness of your financial fragility and result in lower expectations about your own financial future, particularly for those from economically disadvantaged groups. So it's a group that we should be a little bit more sensitive towards going forward. And then policies promoting financial education in high school may be increasing this gap in the subjective financial well-being between those with and without a high school education, with and without a college education, by maybe contributing to these differences in aspirations, right? And maybe in these disparities in life trajectories. So having people kind of think about where they are and where they want to go in a different light. Great, thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Hallie and Dr. Urban. Is everyone able to hear me?
I can hear you.
Thank you. Wonderful. My name is Jill Jones, and I am the Managing Director of Research at the National Endowment for Financial Education, or NEFI. I oversee our grant cycle and research activities at NEFI. Before I provide comments about Dr. Urban's research, I want to review NEFI's vision and mission for those who are not familiar. Next slide, please. Last year, NEFI launched its first ever strategic plan, and we updated our mission and vision. So whether you've known us for years or are just getting to know us, I wanted to highlight our direction. We hope that everyone here shares in our vision for a nation where everyone has the knowledge, confidence, and opportunity to live their best financial life. Our mission is to champion effective financial education, and we do that as an independent, centralizing voice, providing leadership, research, and collaboration to advance financial well-being. Next slide, please. Over the past couple of years, NEFI has developed and revised our personal finance ecosystem, which I think is a helpful reference point as I discuss Dr. Urban's research today. The purpose of the ecosystem is to lay out the foundations that underpin an individual's level of financial well-being, give relational context to the elements that comprise financial well-being and its influences, and right-size expectations for what various educational and behavioral influencers, interventions, and efforts can realistically achieve. For the purposes of discussing Carly's work today, I want to highlight the aspects of the ecosystem that resonate with her work. Specifically, her paper explores foundational factors by looking at aspects of an individual's background that would be agnostic to financial education interventions. If you look at the bottom portion of the ecosystem, this is where we have classified these foundational factors. Second, the exploration of high school financial education is classified under the knowledge influencers activity, so the purple arrow connected to financial capability. Also under that category could be financial information and tools. In the case of Dr. Urban's study, some of the students might receive a lighter dosage of financial education than others, given that the treatment sample includes individuals who graduated from states that have varying requirements for the financial education requirement, as you heard Dr. Urban state. So ranging from perhaps a couple lessons within a course, which might just be a 2-hour exposure, to a full course focused on financial education, which would obviously entail many more hours. In speaking with Dr. Urban a few weeks ago, she expressed that they would not have enough power to analyze the effects of different dosages of financial education at this time. Specifically, it is not possible right now to look at the differences between those who only had a 2-hour exposure to financial education to those who had a full course. Nevertheless, Dr. Urban's methodology is strong and the results are compelling. The third area, policy, protection, regulation, are at play here, given that state mandates are the mechanism that informs the knowledge influencers in this case. Finally, the other primary component that is incorporated into this research is the measurement of financial well-being, which you see at the top of this pyramid. Given the unique design of this study using difference in difference methods, it is not necessary to incorporate other control factors, though you did hear Dr. Urban discuss the ways in which those don't differ, as state controls and socioeconomic controls, for example. Indeed, in comparing these treatment and control samples, Dr. Urban and her colleagues found that the samples resembled each other for key demographic attributes, which further emphasizes the strength of this study. Next, I will discuss 2 questions that emerged for me as I was interpreting these results. Next slide, please. We know that role models are important in education. For example, scholars in certain disciplines fare better when they see their identities represented within their discipline. For example, female and minority scholars who study science, technology, engineering, and mathematics are more likely to persist through their degree program in the presence of mentors and teachers who have a similar demographic profile. To this point, we know that males more consistently teach social sciences and economics education. Aside from the differences we see in financial well-being for this study in particular, we also see differential performance whereby men outperform women on financial literacy metrics and economic education testing. Furthermore, some of the earliest financial education programs and curricula, including NIFI's high school program, were likely designed by men. This isn't to suggest that the curricula is wrong or flawed, but that it might resonate more with individuals who resemble its creators, that being men with higher levels of education. Obviously, this is a theory that could be tested. So my question, could research investigate whether the gender of a student's personal finance teacher affects subsequent well-being or performance outcomes? Are the curricula more resonant with majority groups? If culturally sensitive curricula is developed, do we close the well-being and performance gaps we currently see? Building on this and pertaining to the differences observed across educational attainment, if we were to critique the educational intervention with this lens, is it that financial education content focuses too much on traditional post-secondary options? Are students not receiving enough financial information that is relevant to their personal circumstances after high school graduation? I'll share a few tables that illustrate some differences in debt and life events by degree attainment. Next slide, please. Based on research conducted by Dr. Rachel Dwyer at The Ohio State University, we know that when compared to individuals with a bachelor's degree, those with an associate's degree are exposed to higher interest rates on student loans, have more vehicle and credit card debt, and a higher rate of loan delinquency. Additionally, vehicle and consumer debt are more common at every age for associate's degree holders. Next slide, please. This study also revealed that individuals experience major life events differently when looking at their educational background. For example, those not holding a post-secondary degree or those holding an associate's degree experience major life events such as marriage and childbearing at an earlier age, and for associate's degree holders during the same time as they pursue their 2-year degree. So going back to the question I posed a minute ago, is financial education curricula preparing students to make sound financial decisions regardless of their educational pathway? And is that therefore potentially impacting their subjective financial well-being? Next slide, please. That concludes my remarks for today. I look forward to hearing your questions and thoughts at the end of this session.
Thanks, Jill. I'm Kathy Blumenfeld, and as Hallie mentioned earlier, I serve as the Cabinet Secretary for Governor Evers and head up the Wisconsin Department of Financial Institutions, which we commonly lovingly refer to as DFI. Next slide, please. At DFI, we have a vision of financial well-being for Wisconsin. We're dedicated to protecting the safety and soundness of Wisconsin's financial institutions, safeguarding the investing public, facilitating commerce, and increasing financial capability throughout the state. Next slide, please. In fact, building financial capabilities is one of our 3 strategic pillars, along with modernizing our agency and investing in our people. Next slide, please. The work of building financial capability is driven by DFI's Office of Financial Literacy, which promotes financial literacy and capability as a life skill. Some of you may be familiar with our director, Dave Mansell. The research conducted by the Center for Financial Security provides practitioners additional insight on where and how to concentrate their financial capability work. And we welcome this insight and new research in our work too. Our Office of Financial Literacy provides information on personal finance and investor protection. We help expand opportunities for youth and adults through financial literacy education. In addition, we administer the Wisconsin's College Savings Program, and we provide free resources to help Wisconsinites plan for post-secondary education and address student debt. As a matter of fact, we just completed a governor's study on student debt here in Wisconsin. Overall, we work to elevate personal finance in Wisconsin by bringing people together to focus on issues and serve as a catalyst for change. One example of this work is our Governor's Council on Financial Literacy, which we're pleased to have Michael Collins serve on our board. Through the Governor's Council, we encourage statewide financial literacy initiatives. We also provide grants to schools to implement personal finance education, and we encourage collaboration between financial institutions and schools to have student-run bank or credit union branches in school, as well as supporting our newly created virtual reality fairs for schools. DFI also works to connect the dots between our state agencies through our Intra-Agency Financial Capability Committee, which encourages workplace financial literacy among state employees. We're also expanding our focus to promote financial inclusion, especially amongst our most vulnerable populations. DFI has been focused on building financial capability for well over a decade. We have a lot going on in our small but mighty financial capability team, and certainly no shortage of passion around these issues. Next slide, please. Wisconsin was the first state to have standalone personal finance standards in 2006. Academic standards define what students should know and be able to do at each grade level. Next slide, please. Wisconsin standards were updated this June, version 2.0, to include a new financial mindset area as one of the subject's 6 strands, joining education and employment, money management, savings and investing, credit and debt, and risk management and insurance. These standards are intended to help schools and educators at all grade levels develop programs that provide knowledge and skills to establish sound financial habits. The addition of the financial mindset strand sets Wisconsin apart from other states and national standards because it addresses the mental habits needed to make sound financial decisions. So we're excited for the timing and insight of the research we're discussing today, because it will complement how Wisconsin implements the new standards, especially the financial mindset component. Financial well-being, how people feel about their finances, and the financial mindset in Wisconsin state standards are clearly related, because financial well-being includes people's subjective sense of financial management, as well as their confidence in achieving their unique financial goals. Carly mentioned earlier about the CFPB and their financial well-being measurements, those having control over one's finances, having the capability to absorb financial shock, being on track to meet financial goals, and being able to make choices that allow one to enjoy life. This is critically important for all Wisconsinites, which is why we established 2 state policies relating to personal finance. Next slide, please. Wisconsin state policies were established in 2013 and 2017. Again, next slide, please. The first policy established in 2013 dealt with academic and career planning, which interconnect with personal finance and can help students appreciate and finance higher education. The ACP policy is intended to equip students and their families with the tools necessary to make more informed choices about post-secondary education, training, and careers for life after high school. ACP is part of the Wisconsin Department of Public Instruction's overall vision for every student to graduate high school with the academic, social, and emotional skills to be ready for life after high school. To this end, Wisconsin established a state requirement for personal finance, which says school districts are required to adopt and implement personal finance standards for K through 12. This is not a mandate for a standalone 1 semester course required for high school graduation. However, now that Wisconsin has a statewide requirement for personal finance, most, if not all, school districts will adopt the new personal finance standards. Next slide, please. Wisconsin is a local control state, meaning each of our 426 school districts are responsible for the operations and curriculum for their individual school districts. Next slide. In 2010, DFI started measuring personal finance requirements by school district and discovered that 25% of Wisconsin high schools had self-imposed graduation requirements in personal finance that year. This number rose to more than 70% in 2017, in part due to the efforts providing teacher trainings, presenting to school boards, offering and awarding school grants, running awareness campaigns, and awarding individuals and organizations for their efforts in measurably improving personal financial literacy in Wisconsin. It could be said that this Johnny Appleseed approach led the way for the 2017 state requirement for all school districts to adopt and implement personal finance standards. Next slide, please. In Wisconsin, there's 137 high schools, not districts, that have implemented a 1 semester personal finance graduation requirement. This is measured by Next Gen Personal Finance. Next slide, please. Next Gen Personal Finance measures the implementation of personal finance education in high schools. And you can see the map here happens to be of Wisconsin, and it shows that 137 high schools, again, not districts, but high schools, that have implemented a 1 semester personal finance graduation requirement, meeting Next Gen's gold standard. However, this also means that only 33% of high school students in Wisconsin are required to complete a one-semester personal finance course. And if you're interested in looking at, if you're in Wisconsin, interested in looking at your high schools and your areas, making sure they're right, or if you live in another state, this is a very interactive website. And if you have information to update this, you can certainly submit that to Next Gen Personal Finance, and they will update the information. Next slide, please. So we're really grateful to the Center for Financial Security, all the researchers. Carly, you've done some great work here, the nonprofits, NEFI, educators, practitioners, everyone in this ecosystem that has worked to increase financial capability. We're working hard in Wisconsin. We know you're working hard in each of your respective states. And we think that this research is so important as it informs how we deliver the academic and career planning, how we deliver financial literacy education. And with this knowledge, we can tailor the curriculum to help make sure that especially our most vulnerable communities are getting the right information and the right education at the right time, and that we help to continue to evolve this work and increase financial capability all over. So thank you. We hope you learned something from this today, and I think we move into the next phase of questions.
Yes, that's right. Thanks so much, Kathy, Jill, and Carly, for those excellent presentations. And I'm so excited that we have plenty of time because we have a lot of questions rolling in from the audience. So I'm going to go ahead and jump right into those. And I have a question that actually I feel like it works really well, just piggybacking on what Kathy was mentioning. And so I'll just take this first question and direct it towards Kathy. So in looking at standards or the standards requirements, what can you say about how policymakers are taking into account behavioral change research, or so research such as what Carly presented today in mandating financial education or creating curriculum?
Well, I can tell you that as the convening happened for the new standards, the version 2.0, it was a very diverse group of people that came together, including, researchers, academic, policy people, teachers, experts in the field. And so I feel like this research and other research that has been done before is really informing the development, which is why that financial mindset strand became so important, and really understanding and making sure that it's not just objective measurements all the time, that the subjective piece and the decision-making piece and the emotional intelligence, all those things get wrapped into the overall curriculum. So it was a very diverse group of people that provided input into the new standards.
And Kathy, your presentation makes it really clear that Wisconsin is a leader in this area, a leader in the field. Can you speak to any of the relationship that you might have with other states and how they are developing their standards? Is Wisconsin kind of taking the lead, or kind of a model, or how are you working with other states, or are you?
So Dave Mansell, who is the director of our Office of Financial Literacy, I think most people that have been in the space have worked with him, know him, and he's often tapped into for information, as well as Sheila Briggs and other folks that are at the Department of Public Instruction. Next Gen Personal Finance, as I mentioned in my presentation, NEFI, others have been really good at collecting best practices in this area, as well as working with the CFPB and other organizations. So yes, I think Wisconsin is a leader and continues to be committed to be a leader. We also learn from other states as well. So we're into a very collaborative environment, and we'll stay focused on this and stay focused on continuing to hone the curriculum and continue to be a leader. We know that 53% of our Wisconsinites live paycheck to paycheck, and that was before COVID. So we have a lot of work to do in the state to improve upon that. And we're just very committed to doing everything we can to further work in this area.
Very good, thank you. And this question, I'll direct it towards Carly first, but then Jill, please feel free to speak up following Carly's answer, because both of you kind of touched on this, or you touched on parallel issues. So obviously this study really looks at the gender differences in subjective financial well-being as a result of financial education, or tied to financial education. So a question that came up was, what can we say about race? And Carly, were you able to pull that data out? Yep. Oh, you were, okay.
Yep, so we did look at race. I would say it was underpowered, so I can't say anything with any confidence. We did not see any statistical differences across any races, but it's just underpowered. We had really big standard errors and not big enough samples, so that's why we're not talking about that.
Great. Jill, I'm not sure if you had anything else to add, but I do wonder if you, obviously Carly mentioned this particular research, she can't really speak to that based on this study, but Jill, you did talk a little bit about, if you have an instructor that is male, and perhaps the curriculum might be, it might be more relevant or for a male as opposed to a woman. So how do you think that might play out? I know, Carly, obviously I would just want to make sure we're not talking about this study when we're talking about race, but do you have any anecdotal information about how race could come into play when we're talking about teachers or curriculum, et cetera?
Absolutely, yeah. So the research that I was talking about in terms of what we see in STEM education, so science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, it's not just about gender, it's also about race and ethnicity. And I didn't talk about that because I knew that what Carly had mentioned in terms of the power and that not being something that showed as being statistically significant in this case, but it is definitely something that is right in alignment with what I was talking about in terms of gender, which is when we see our identities reflected in those who are teaching us, it does contribute to more positive outcomes. And so the outcomes that have been studied are persistence, degree completion in the post-secondary space. And so I think there's definitely, when the data becomes better such that we can make those inferences, there's definitely room to explore that, in what ways does the lack of diversity or representation of teachers affect the ways in which students then take those lessons to heart or feel connected to the lessons that they're receiving.
Thank you. Let's see, I'm going to go ahead and send this one to Carly, but then Jill, please feel free to follow up as well. Do you have any information in the data around parent or family influence on a student's financial well-being? And if not, are you able to look at proxies? For instance, is the parent a homeowner, the parent's credit scores, et cetera?
So the short answer is no, but the thing is we're watching them when they're 18 to 45. So in that span, they should be financially independent. And we're comparing these treated students, these students who got financial education per requirement, to those who just by chance didn't, right? So those students who didn't shouldn't look any different in terms of those characteristics of the household. So I don't think it should be a big difference. But when we account for things like your own home ownership or your assets or things like that, it does not change our effective financial education on your subjective well-being. I want to kind of like rewind a little bit too, to answer your question before about race. There was another study that Melody Harvey, who is now University of Wisconsin faculty member, did about the effects of financial education on payday loans, basically, and she didn't find any difference across race or gender. So the effect of financial education on reducing your reliance on payday loans was similar across race and gender. So I would say that that's the only clear observational study that we have with respect to race, looking at the difference in the effects of financial education, and there's not clearly a difference. So that would be the one study we can kind of point to.
Interesting. Jill, did you have anything to add to the earlier question?
No, I think that, yeah, Dr. Irvin's summary in terms of the ways in which, oh my goodness, I'm blanking on I got excited about what Carly was talking about with Melody's work. Could you repeat the question for me? Sorry.
Yeah, it was just having to do with parent and family influence on a
Yes.
student's financial well-being. And for this particular study, Carly did make it clear this is a long term, so it's so interesting we have up to age 45. But do you have any other information, maybe outside of this study?
Absolutely. Yeah, so family socialization is really important. It's sort of part of those foundational factors. And so, to Carly's point, we don't necessarily have information on the effects. And we would think that, this treatment would be agnostic to that. So yeah, I don't have anything sort of related to this specifically, but outside of this study, we do know that it is important in terms of informing future behaviors and future views on financial education. Or financial decision making. And so there is more research being conducted in this area. And I'm excited to see with new measures that emerge around family socialization, the ways in which we might have increased sophistication in looking at that moving forward. I do know that the FINRA study does include some metrics of family socialization, but they're only just a couple of items and they're not particularly robust in terms of really getting at the depth of family socialization.
Thank you. And it looks like we do have some participants who've listened in today who are pretty familiar with the financial well-being survey. And so one audience member asked that, he mentioned that the financial well-being survey includes questions on objective and subjective financial knowledge. So have you tried to use those items to create a measurement of overconfidence and test gender difference? So this is obviously going to Carly.
Yeah, we have looked at the knowledge questions as well in the National Financial Capability Study. The financial well-being scale does not have anything related to knowledge in it. So I want to make that clear. We're using the 5-item scale, and they're all, with the exception of one question about do you have money left over at the end of the month, the rest are all very subjective questions about how you feel about your financial situation. And when we looked at knowledge, we actually saw no effect of required financial education on knowledge as measured by the big 3 questions that are very common. But I think that measure is a little bit noisy, so it's not surprising that we potentially don't see anything there. We also do something kind of fancy where we simulate guesses for people who skipped those questions or said that they don't know the answer. And if we simulate guesses, we actually see increases in financial literacy. Which is kind of interesting. But yeah, I think we don't want to kind of mush together too many things in a scale, and we don't see these huge knowledge gains. We do see behavior changes though, which is kind of interesting.
And then I did have a question around, or I have a few questions around the actual kind of curriculum and the way that these courses are delivered. So one audience member did ask if you were able to distinguish between the effects of required courses that take place in person versus online, and that some states may require in person, but they may allow online to count as well. So I think that this is probably coming up now also just because of, where we are in the world, the state of school being such a virtual learning experience for many, many people these days. Do you have any way of looking at that, Carly?
So I think Jill actually answered this really well in her discussion. We would love to be able to look at like what modalities are the most effective and what types of state policies are more effective. There's just not enough power to do that in this kind of a study. Yeah, I think there's room for future research. To the best of my knowledge, there is no state requirement in their standards or their graduation requirements that they have spelled out that really carefully discusses the policy around like what's allowed versus whether or not this has to be face-to-face or online. I think there are a lot of workarounds, and compliance isn't 100% regardless. It's not even close to that. So in states that require a course to be personal finance is required within an embedded course, so within like economics or something else, when you put personal finance in another course, only about a third of schools comply and actually have a required class that's either a standalone or an integrated class. So schools are underfunded. We know that. Teachers are overly taxed. This is kind of another thing that they have to do. We think that the benefits exceed the cost in general, but I mean, there are always going to be workarounds, and I would actually argue that workarounds are maybe better than not doing anything, right? Potentially. Maybe that's an open research question too.
And then I have a question. I'm going to send this over to you, Jill, and it has to do with the requirements of teachers or instructors who actually provide the financial education. And basically, this person was kind of asking about what are the differences, which I don't expect you to answer that. We are a large, United States, so I'm sure it differs from state to state. But I guess this person was also just looking for some insights on what are some of the expectations around training or certifications, or what makes a person a good instructor of financial education? It's a pretty broad question,
Yeah.
but feel free to weigh in as you can.
Yeah, that's a great question, and I don't necessarily have the answer to that, other than saying, that could be a potential research question that someone could explore. I don't know in our space that that's really been systemically studied. I don't know, Kathy, do you actually have any insight on this, like in what ways teacher training might differ and how we judge the efficacy of their training and effectiveness as a teacher in our space?
I don't have anything specific on it, but I do know that confidence will play an important role. That's not academically proven, but one of the issues we see where school districts aren't offering a class is just that there is not a teacher that feels confident to get up in the front of the room and teach the curriculum. So part of what we focus on with a lot of the teacher training is really not only embedding the knowledge in the teacher, but building their confidence so that when they teach it, just like anything, if they're passionate about it, I think the outcomes are going to be much better.
Yeah, absolutely. That's the only studies that I'm aware of in terms of that, the confidence and the research on confidence for teachers, but less of an assessment in terms of, how can you differentiate between good and bad. So it sounds like we're consistent there in terms of our understanding for confidence and how important it is for the teachers to feel confident and efficacious about what they're teaching. And professional development certainly contributes in helping that efficacy. And we do see that for some professional development interventions, that teachers do feel more confident with their teaching after engaging in specific training around financial education.
Okay, I have one more question that I'm going to throw out there. I'd like each one of you to answer the question. So Carly, then Jill, then Kathy, and try to answer it in just this last minute that we have. So quick answer, quick question. what should be the focus of research going forward to build on not only this research, but to continue to build on this field? Carly.
I think we have to think about access more. We think a lot about education, but if you have no access to low-cost financial services, what are we teaching? So thinking about that intersection.
Thank you. Jill.
Yeah, repeating a little bit of what I said, culturally sensitive curricula, I think is definitely an area that can be improved and focused upon moving forward.
Very good,
I would
Kathy.
agree. And just tailoring it for our more vulnerable communities, which is a similar way to say what Jill is saying, but I think that's really, really important.
Well, with that, thank you so much for all of your perspectives. Thanks very much to our presenters for taking the time out of your busy schedules to share your research and your input on state-mandated education. And just as a reminder, this webinar was recorded and it will be posted on our website, cfs.wisc.edu, along with the slides that were presented. And again, I want to thank everyone who joined us today, presenters and audience members alike. Please stay safe, stay healthy, and be well. Thank you.